So today I'm going to be talking about the move both nationally and globally towards more collaborative and structured postgraduate education, and to look at the drivers of that move and to look at some of the implications of that move as we consider whether this is something we should be doing across South Africa. I think it's important to first note that we have, of course, got this rapid increase in postgraduate student numbers, and that's a global phenomenon too. Whether that's to do with the fact that we're supposedly in a knowledge economy where we need far more high skills in our human capital, or whether it's indicative of academic inflation where jobs that used to require a degree now require a master's or a PhD, is uncertain. But certainly the increase in numbers is a global phenomenon. But along with this increase in number come global concerns about retention and throughput. And so around the world, we see similar problems to those that we face in this country of high dropout and long time to completion. In South Africa, the National Development Plan, as you all know, has set the goal of 5,000 PhDs per year. And we also have the funding formula as an incentive, which rewards postgraduate level education very well, particularly at PhD level. And then we also have the university capacity development grants, which are another driver to try and ensure that we get more postgraduate students graduating and that our academics in our universities get PhDs. However, we see alongside this rapid increase in numbers a concern that particularly in the humanities and social sciences, which includes education, law, commerce, and so on, we have this dominance of this one-on-one model of supervision. And as far back as 2009 in the CHE CREST report, in 2010 in the ASAF report, we have concerns being raised that universities rely very heavily on the one-on-one model, even though that has been linked to poor retention and throughput for all sorts of reasons I'll explain in a moment. And then more recently, in 2015, Clute, Maton and Shepherd produced their book looking at doctoral education in South Africa. They again raised concerns about the model. And then most recently, we have the 2022 report, national report by the CHE on doctoral degrees, which once again raises this concern. What I'm drawing on largely here is a scoping review of the international literature in which Susan van Schalkwyk from Stellenbosch University and myself looked at the literature over a 20-year period on doctoral education to try and identify shifts in the way in which it was curriculated. And we found many different models being identified in this literature. And indeed, we certainly found examples of this one-on-one model. The one-on-one model goes by many different names in the literature, which makes it somewhat confusing. Obviously, the most common name, one-on-one model, but it's also known as the tutorship model, the master-apprentice model, the lonely scholar model, and the Oxbridge model. And this last name, I think, is particularly interesting because it tells you the heritage of this model, which supposedly comes predominantly from Oxford and Cambridge, which relied very heavily on tutorship, actually from undergrad all the way through to the PhD. Interestingly, if you go to Oxford and Cambridge now, they certainly are still using that model, but it is now the minority model, and they're using some of the other models more widely. And so in South Africa, alongside the single model, a single supervisor, we often have examples of a co-supervisor being brought in for a range of reasons. It can be for a more experienced supervisor to mentor a novice colleague who's just starting out with supervision. It can be because the study requires a particular expertise, perhaps the theory or the methodology or an issue in the topic that the single supervisor doesn't have. And it can also be to try and ensure continuity. If the supervisor, the main supervisor, leaves, we often see problems with students having to be reallocated to new supervisors halfway through their studies. Certainly, adding a co-supervisor brings all of these benefits, but it wasn't this that we mainly identified in the literature as the dominant shift. What we really identified is that there was a range of ways in which universities around the world were including more structure and more collaboration into the doctoral curriculum. Certainly, it's been the norm in the USA for some time, and in fact, in the literature, they often call this particular approach the American model. And we see that this shift that we identify to more structure and collaboration is found in Western Europe, it's found in Canada, it's found in New Zealand and Australia, it's found in Russia, it's found in China, Brazil, Nigeria, Mauritius, Kenya, and many more countries. Again, many different names for these structure and collaboration and many different forms. So, for example, you might have a supervision panel, you might have a cohort model, a doctoral school, students working in project teams, and in the literature there was also a lot of identification of very specific models which were named after the particular project, like innovative training networks, Carter, INSEPE, and so on. Typically, but not always, these models include coursework or required short courses. They typically include clear progress milestones and deadlines by which students have to have met those milestones, and if students fail to meet them, they may be given permission to continue, but they need to be able to explain why they've missed the deadline and what they'll put in place to meet future deadlines. Very often there was an examination kind of stop-go at about halfway through or at the end of the first year, especially in American colleges, where having done the coursework, students would have to write an exam or do a formal presentation which would determine whether they could continue. There was a 7-year outer deadline set for completion in most institutions, and that's an interesting one because in South Africa our outer deadline is often set by universities at less than 7 years, but that's very much the outer deadline. There was required attendance at seminars, peer presentations, guest lectures, and so on. So these were not ad hoc, nice-to-haves that students were encouraged to attend. They were actually formally curriculated and seen as part of the doctoral program. There was a very clearly defined relationship between the supervisor panel or supervisory team, or indeed individual supervisors, with the students, including very high-frequency meetings, shared resources within the team, very much in the nature of the natural sciences model, where students will be working together in a laboratory and using the same equipment. This became the model in these structured doctoral programs in the humanities and social sciences, whether that be readings or even shared data. Often these teams, these doctoral schools, these programs would include master's students and postdoctoral fellows as well. And they often included the opportunity for some kind of mobility, some kind of seminar abroad or workplace projects. So they were certainly constructed in very innovative ways. As you can see on this slide, there was a continuum that we can identify in these different models, with the ones on the left-hand side having much less structure and fewer collaborative opportunities, and the ones on the right-hand side having much more structure and more collaborative opportunities. And the worry is that the ones on the far left-hand side, the one-on-one supervision with no additional support, or the co-supervision with no additional support, are very much linked with the slow time to completion and with the high dropout, what Liz Harrison calls the lonely scholar model. Once you get to the middle, we still have that same model with some ad hoc support, often by a Centre for Postgraduate Studies. But if you look at the two models on the right-hand side, these are the models that are very closely aligned to supposed improvements in throughput and retention, and which are the direction in which universities around the world are going. On the far right, you get this very much a cohort model with the not one supervisor. You work with a team, you're often working in project teams, coursework, and so on. But it's important to note that the second to right bubble circle there, which tells you about the one-on-one and co-supervision, but with curriculated structure and collaboration. So it seems that it's not the issue is not with the one-on-one or co-supervision model in and of itself necessarily. The problem is when that is all that the student gets in terms of their postgraduate studies. But when there is a very formal curriculated collaborative space that students engage with other supervisors, with other students, and have various deadlines and so on, that actually meets this need for a community. The literature gave all sorts of different reasons for why there has been this global shift towards more collaborative, more structured models. Certainly very key in the literature, as you can see here, is this idea that we're in a knowledge economy, and so we need more efficient models of postgraduate education. Another reason is that the one-on-one or co-supervision model is very labor-intensive. You're sitting with one person, with one student, one supervisor, possibly two supervisors, in a room behind closed doors, and the supervisor is having to repeat things over and over again to each student, rather than allowing students, having space to have that conversation with a group of students and allowing students to learn from each other. There's also a shift in funding towards such models. A lot of the funding bodies want to see much more structure and collaboration, and are more likely to fund a project team than they are to fund individual studies. This has been an international trend too. It's also seen to be more stable and more scalable. So if a supervisor leaves, there's far less disruption, the study can continue. And then, interestingly, in some countries, it's actually legislated. Now, we have very clear institutional autonomy in South Africa, although we have the EQPE, which dictates certain things about how we should run our qualifications. We generally don't have rules around the models we should use. But in Russia and in China and in Kenya, you actually have state legislation that speaks to the requirement that you have structured doctoral programs. You would have heard me say earlier that it is supposedly more efficient. And it was really hard for us to find literature that gave hard data on whether these models do in fact improve retention and throughput. There was certainly a lot of literature, as you can see on the slide now, some examples of that literature, that linked these models to better completion rates and explicitly said that they resulted in better completion rates, but didn't actually provide the data. The exception to that was a really interesting study by Skopek, Treventi, and Blossfield, who did a large-scale study of 30 cohorts of doctoral students across 3 major shifts towards more collaborative, structured models. And they found indeed much better retention and throughput. They identified 3 core reasons for these improvements. They said it was because of the density of supervision and support structures that fostered a shorter and more successful doctoral studies, the implementation of explicit deadlines, and then interestingly, the extension of funding from 3 years to 4 years, and thereby the extension of the norm to complete the doctorate from 3 years to 4 years. And this is something important to note, because in South Africa, the norm is just over 4 years, but a lot of people in a lot of universities follow the idea that it should be a 3-year qualification as the norm, rather than as the happy exception. And this is a bit strange, given that the 4-year norm is certainly the international norm. Another reason given for this move was that there's far more internationalization. And so students needed a doctoral program that didn't just speak to one particular context. And having project teams in doctoral schools often worked across institutions. And so they were exposed to a range of different researchers and theories and so on. There were often joint doctorates with study abroad semesters. And there was often the integration of national and international doctoral networks into these programs. So formal and informal networks that exist amongst researchers were often used to structure these doctoral programs. Another big driver to this more structured and collaborative model was the idea that interdisciplinarity is needed in many more doctoral studies than perhaps used to be the case. And when you have an interdisciplinary study, students need supervisors who bring that expertise, and traditional supervisors have deep expertise within one field. And so it's very useful to be working with a team who are bringing together varied expertise. There was also the idea that by working in these teams, students will get to interact with at least a couple of cutting-edge researchers in the field. They may well have a fairly novice supervisor that they're working with on a day-to-day basis, but through the regular curriculated seminars and presentations and so on, they will be speaking to and learning from researchers at the top of their game. Of course, this is not necessarily a given. It will depend how the course the program is curriculated. There were also, though, some concerns about the idea that interdisciplinarity is the right model for everyone, because at times perhaps it allows students to do more wide but perhaps more superficial studies without the depth of disciplinary knowledge. So certainly the literature wasn't entirely saying this is definitively the way to go for all doctoral schools. Another big driver was industry. There was a lot of examples in the literature of doctoral education being much more strongly linked to industry than in the past, either through a professional doctorate or through work-integrated learning and work placements and internships, all of which were seen to allow opportunities for students to actually apply the knowledge that they are creating in their doctorate, and possibly with longer-term employability advantages. And increasingly, industry actually funds the studies and has input into the identification of the research problem that the doctoral program will be interrogating. But there was also a lot of concerns about this particular shift and warnings about how it should be managed, because, of course, working with industry is always politically infused. If industry frames the problem, we need to be very aware that they have a profit motive, that they are problem focused, that they may not understand perhaps the focus on advancing knowledge that is so key to the doctorate, as opposed to finding a solution to the problem. So it's often more pragmatic, and industry partners were at times frustrated by what they saw as the unnecessarily rigorous nature of the doctorate. And then, of course, there's the issue that industry may well have agendas that are counter to the public good responsibilities of our students and our universities. There was also an indication in the literature that this move was a process of ensuring better quality of the doctorate, because the one-on-one model depended entirely on the quality of the supervisor and co-supervisor. It was very uneven. Where you have these more collaborative models, supposedly you will have better quality. But the literature also suggested that while this collaborative model can diffuse some of the toxic power relations that can happen behind closed doors of the one-on-one model, it can also sometimes be indicative of universities' increasing demands to monitor and manage the educational process, and to have a kind of a lack of trust in the supervisors. So there was a slight concern that a lot of the shift towards these models came with a lot more reporting, monitoring, and so on. But certainly the model does allow for a more nurturing intellectual space. And we need to be careful that it's not just seen to be about bringing about greater efficiencies and getting students through the system. So it's really important that any university that makes these shifts towards collaborative and structured models focuses on the creation of a nurturing intellectual space, and not just on this idea that it's going to be more efficient. If it's carefully monitored, it's all about instrumentalist efficiency. Power. Students are facing diverse opinions in these models. It can be difficult to navigate. But if this is managed in a collegial way, it can actually be a modeling of the way in which knowledge creation is contentious. When students go out and have a research career, they're going to have to get used to getting different opinions from different reviewers in a journal article, for example, and they need to learn how to speak back to diverse opinions. But certainly this assumes a collegial environment within the doctoral school. So being able to discuss the contestations around legitimacy of knowledge and the ways of knowing and the effects this has on the community is central to building a really productive doctoral community. What's really, really important, and something I really want to emphasize, is that putting in place the structure is not enough. If you curriculate for presentations, for deadlines, for coursework, this has to be done within an explicit culture formation. You can have all that structure in a toxic environment and it's not going to work. There needs to be very explicit discussion amongst the supervisors, amongst the scholars, and between those groups of people about roles, about expectations, about the norms and values that will underpin that doctoral school. There were definitely challenges identified in this move. It takes investment in time and resources to make these shifts. Often the more experienced supervisors who've been using one model for decades might resist this movement. My view is you work with those who are enthusiastic and allow those who are not to continue with the status quo. But that's my view. In some cases, the literature showed, especially in countries where it was a state requirement, that academics were pushed, sometimes kicking and screaming, towards these new models. It's also important to note that these team approaches, particularly interdisciplinary teams, often operate outside the disciplinary structure of universities. And a lot of our rules, our structures, our incentives assume that students register in a single department. They assume that a workload for postgraduate supervision rests with one single supervisor or is shared with a co-supervisor. There is not necessarily an understanding of these more fluid approaches. So, to sum it up, the shift towards more structured, collaborative models of postgraduate education, and particularly at doctoral level, is global. It's often not in place of the one-on-one and co-supervision model, but it often is formally curriculated to augment it. It is not an ad hoc support structure. And just to remind you of this graphic, the problem seems to exist with the two circles on the left-hand side, where students are relying entirely on the relationship with their supervisor, and the supervisor is bearing the entire burden for the student's progress and is expected to have all the expertise and is expected to navigate what can sometimes be quite a complicated relationship without having a community in which to do so. So having some kind of ad hoc support, as many universities are now offering through their postgraduate studies, is definitely the way to go. But it seems like the real shifts that is needed are towards the last two. Either retaining the model with curriculated support or indeed moving to more collaborative supervision models as well. So the formation of nurturing spaces where peers support each other and learn from each other alongside their supervisors is found to increase commitment and accountability and enhance retention and throughput. What are the possibilities? Well, we can look at pre-existing networks like a EQPE or Carter and so on. We can start to share resources instead of each university and each department, each supervisor developing their own resources. The postgradenvironments.com resources, the TUSO resources. These are already online Creative Commons resources that people can use. We might need to have more support within our universities to think through the implications of these shifts and what is needed. And importantly, we need to remember that the literature suggested that it's not just implementing the structure that's needed, it's a culture of having a research-rich environment that works against that lonely scholar model. Thank you.